the birth or the origin of the vegan social movement then. And obviously when we get to the actual movement itself, which is going to be another time, but we're going to be talking about the birth of our movement in the sense of being born during the Second World War, so-called, and the significance of that, which is very, very kind of significant. A lot of the founders of our movement found the war experience absolutely shattering. That's for another time. So as I said, we're talking about the lead up really to the birth. And there's always a disclaimer that I have to give at this stage, which is whenever I talk about the vegan social movement, I'm not making any claims apart from the fact that these are the people who came together and formed, as far as we know, the very first organized social movement. And also they called it the vegan movement. So they gave it the name. In fact, at the end of this session, our movement will still not be named. And so that's for another time. So in an interview in 2004, Donald Watson said that the birth of the vegan movement had been very difficult, and not least because of the relationship with the vegetarian movement. Watson had an interesting take on that. I mean, first of all, he called vegetarians lactose as some, I don't know whether it was an insult in the, in the kind of same kind of vein as carnists, but he definitely called them the lactose. So he rejected vegetarianism in the end, Donald Watson. He said that vegetarianism is only possible due to humanity's capacity to exploit the reproduction system or functions of other species. And this is a characteristic of this session. That sounds quite a modern claim. And what you'll find all the way through this is that we're going to go back to 1909 and then forward, right? And yeah, Michael, it's a good insult. Yeah, the lactose. That's right. And so, we're going to go right back there. And a lot of the claims that you'll see sound really modern. And I suppose there's two ways of looking at that. It means that things remain the same. You could say, well, does that mean we haven't made much progress? Or just means that the fundamental arguments are the same. So we'll see all that. Watson would attack vegetarianism, and a lot of them did, but he said that we shouldn't attack vegetarians. So this is the kind of position that I've taken over the years, not least because vegetarians themselves are often full of remorse for their vegetarianism, in the sense that you see time and time again people going, how could I have spent so much time as a vegetarian? And what they mean is so many years ignorant of what they were doing, essentially. And so, the vegetarians are a little bit kind of shocked about that. But we'll see some of the argument as it develops. He said there's no need for animosity between the two groups. They ought to kind of work together. And of course, back in those days, people might have thought that vegetarianism was a gateway to veganism. There certainly was an apparent connection. And that feeds into the fact that the vegans wanted to have a particular section within the vegetarian society. And again, we'll come up onto that. So the timescale then, initially at least, is that between 1909 and then 1912, there was a lengthy correspondence about eggs and dairy. It kind of got cut off by the First World War, so-called, and that was 1914 to 18. And then it started again after that. And so there was a long correspondence, and it all took place here, which is the Vegetarian Messenger and Health Review. Just going to drop that to there. Some of the claims, as I said, are very kind of modern that went on here. And there was a lot of vegetarians who had become uncomfortable in seeing vegetarians consuming eggs and dairy in particular, and also the honey situation developed as well. Let's go to the first example, really. Again, this is from 1909 itself. And someone said, vegetarians so-called are responsible for their share of the numbers of cows, calves, and fowl killed. BC, almost all vegetarians I know are vegetarians because they simply don't like the taste or texture of meat. Okay, they don't care about animal rights. That's quite interesting. But of course, some people would claim that vegetarianism itself is a is a philosophy, and followed by people like Gandhi and so forth. And so there would be a lot of people who you would call ethical vegetarians. But from a vegan mindset, that's a difficult concept to get our heads around because it's inconsistent. In fact, Watson called vegetarianism a kind of halfway house as well. So we probably wouldn't use the word foul anymore, but again, we're products of our time in that sense. But some of the comments that they did make were just about birds. Here's one. It's not possible to have eggs without having on your hands a number of male birds who must be killed. So this is the kind of cockerel problem, as it was often talked about by the early members of the vegan movement. And again, vegetarians often have difficulty accepting this, even to this day. Certainly back then they did. And as you'll see, there was a bit of pushback from this developing kind of strand within vegetarianism. Another example would be, and this is said to be possibly the very first vegan cookbook. This is 1910. It's by Rupert Weldon, No Animal Food. Now, the kind of status of the very first vegan cookbook is contested. I mean, obviously, it would be a vegan cookbook before the word vegan. But Weldon said it's quite impossible to consume dairy products without slaughter, as it is to eat flesh without slaughter. And again, you get pushback from vegetarians about this issue because they don't see vegetarianism as being connected to killing. In fact, a lot of them would say that the reason they're vegetarian is because they want to avoid killing. This thing, which is kind of obvious to vegans, is not obvious a lot to vegetarians. So, so you can see how the argument started to develop. Another person here, what date is this? Again, 1910, said that once that cows become too old or too diseased to be milked, then they became the butcher's property, which is an interesting phrase. That part of the implication of vegetarianism is often hidden from vegetarians. So, of course, what we do get is some vegetarians fighting back or pushing back against what they perceived as critique, really. They mainly made what we would call welfarist claims. I think, for example, this one here, this is somebody who said they had a diploma from a Scottish dairy school. So they were a vegetarian in a Scottish dairy school. And they stated that cows can be used for milk with no need for cruelty. And anybody on TikTok or anywhere else on social media will know that farmers will still maintain this. They also then went on to say few cows fret over their removed calf, provided that they are not allowed to see or lick it. Now, there's a few red flags here, which I've actually put in red. And as you can imagine, those who know me, this is my emphasis here. And then it goes on, or if it is placed so far away that they, the mothers, cannot hear it. This is one thing that saddens me about the modern movement, in the sense that you still got a lot of advocates calling other animals it. And I know it's difficult not to sometimes. There seems to be a strand of people now who kind of almost suggest that, well, because it's grammatically correct, it's not a problem. But in terms of the political social movement, it is really. So we're up to 1912. Another correspondent who was pushing back, again believed that mother and calf do not suffer much, and again provided that they are not allowed to see one another. And so that became a vegetarian defense of these kind of arguments. When we get up to, again, 1912, this is Dougal Semple. It was a big player in the vegan movement at one point. He was one of the first fruitarians. And when I did this presentation before, I pronounced his first name Dougalt, which I thought is what it was. I was told that you should say Dougal, so I'm going to go with my recommendation and go for Dougal Semple. He stated that he did not believe that milk and eggs were natural foods for human beings. I've always found it fascinating doing the street work in Dublin, seeing all these, because he's gonna make a point about grown-ups, which Donald Watson did as well. But seeing these adults walking past with their calf food, their baby food, and you're just thinking, we've got a never weaned society here, and it's really odd that, you know, these people are going to be on baby food for all of their lives, and almost voluntarily so as well. Michael, no human would want to be referred to as an it, so therefore no non-human animals should be referred to as an it either. The pushback on there, Michael, would be that to say that we often would call human babies it if we didn't know the gender. The real issue is that it's a political matter. It's not a matter of grammar. It's a matter of the fact that we're trying to alter the status of other animals. And also, one of the major blocks to us getting what we want, a vegan world, and also one of the major planks of cultural speciesism, is the property status of other animals. And this reinforces that. And so the argument would be that, you know, why would we in the movement reinforce these difficult issues rather than try to challenge them? Because a lot of what we do as a social movement is to do with our claims. And so part of the battle is always linguistic. And it's been the same with all social movements. And of course, the classic case would be the feminist movement. I always say, you know, when they change the word history to his story to make a political point. Okay, and so, you know, linguistic kind of fights, if you like, are always there or thereabouts. And I suppose it's very prevalent at the moment with what's going on in the trans issue, the trans community, the trans activism, and feminism of different types. You know, Deb Thompson, yeah, makes him into objects and things. Yeah, exactly. And of course, the interesting thing about that is that they are things in law. Other animals are items of property, but that's obviously what we want to change. You know, which is why Francione has got a book, Animals as Persons. It's so weird in our legal system that a corporation can be regarded as a legal person, but other animals are just legal things. Although there's a bit of a kind of animal welfare caveat to that, which is weird, in the sense that they're characterized as sentient things, which puts them in a kind of unique legal position, in the sense that there's things that you can't do to your animal property that you could do to your DVDs and CDs if you still got them, vinyl, you know. But in terms of your actual inanimate property, you could do more with those than you can with your sentient property. But at heart, they're both types of property. So Semple says eggs were meant to produce chickens and not omelets. And cow's milk is a perfect food for a calf, but most assuredly not for a grown-up human being. As I said, Watson made a very similar case, and we see this now, going back to the modern day feel about this, we see this now in memes, don't we, where we've got memes that try to kind of emphasize this issue, that you've got adult humans feasting off baby food of another species, which again, from a vegan point of view, is a really interesting thing. So the argument then within vegetarianism is bubbling away, gets to the stage where in 1912, the editor of the Vegetarian Messenger, he declares that there are two types of vegetarians. And his position on this is really quite interesting. And then, as you'll see, things change a little bit. Two types of vegetarians: those who consumed eggs and dairy and those who didn't. The honey thing is there and thereabouts, but we'll kind of leave that to one side. Now, he said that the minority of non-egg and non-dairy vegetarians had a very strong case. So that phrase becomes very important in the history of the vegan movement. He says that the arguments that he'd seen for eating eggs and dairy, the ones that he'd received through his journal, as it were, as he put it, not satisfactory. So he'd made a stand, if you like, and took one of the harder lines, saying that even though they're in the minority, the non-egg and dairy people were quite right in terms of their analysis. So this phrase non-dairy vegetarian becomes very important because it transpired that the early vegans tried to get a non-dairy section of the vegetarian society. Now, another weird part of this story, or a little quirk perhaps, is the fact that eggs at this point seemingly drop out of the argument. And one reason that I've seen about that from some of the early writing is that post-war, eggs weren't really a big issue, in the sense that there wasn't like an egg industry in the sense that we understand it now. And so there was a growing dairy industry, but the egg industry was just about to kind of kick off. And until then, people were very much kind of free range, kind of small holding type thing. A couple of chickens scratching around in your garden kind of thing. That was very common, especially in kind of fairly rural kind of areas. I mean, in my own life, my sister, who went vegan in the 1970s as well, but she remembers when she was a lass in Yorkshire, and my brother, so she was 8 years older than me and my brother was 10. And when people came in, because my mother had a shop, we lived next door to my uncle's farm, and if they wanted a chicken, my brother and my sister used to have to run out the back, grab a chicken, kill her, pluck her, and then bring her back in within, say, 5 or 10 minutes in order to sell the body. So that was one of the kind of jobs that they did. But it was always this kind of small scale stuff about the eggs in those days. So that kind of explains, in a way, the egg industry, the egg issue disappeared for a little bit, but there's an interesting caveat coming up on that. So we're leaping forward. I've skipped one, I think. All right, I haven't got a slide for this. We're leaping forward to the 1930s now. 1935, Muriel Davis said that cattle must suffer abuse, captivity, and ultimate slaughter for humans to consume cow milk. And so these are still the arguments that are bubbling under. No, I seem to have got out of kilter with my thing a little bit here. Okay, so I said about the egg situation. Now, this is John Davis. Now, he's the former manager and also the historian of the International Vegetarian Union. And he actually said that although everybody was talking about the non-dairy issue then, that phrase was a bit of a catch-all. So eggs didn't disappear, and neither did honey. It's just that it was all kind of subsumed under this one phrase, non-dairy vegetarian. So that's a bit of a kind of quirky issue, if you like. I think I'm back on track with my slides now. Yeah. So we're up to the 1930s. Muriel Davis said that cattle must suffer abuse, captivity, and ultimately slaughter for humans to consume cow milk. And then we get an interesting intervention now, again from the Vegetarian Messenger. So we're up to 1940s. This is 1942 now. So very close to the start of the vegan social movement. And so obviously things are moving on, and as it were, things are coming to a head. And so there's a bit of a change within the Vegetarian Journal, in the sense that they were very supportive about the idea of the non-egg and non-dairy vegetarians. But then they came out with this statement, which essentially was an articulation of a kind of step-by-step approach. And I think it's a pretty interesting thing to have come up just before we ended up with the vegan society. So they wrote in their journal that few vegetarians, however strict they may be, would claim the impossible, namely absolute consistency. Now, a little bit of conjecture from me here is, I don't know for sure, but I wonder whether this kind of feeling that was within the community of vegetarian stroke vegans eventually led to the inclusion of practicable and possible in the official definition of veganism. Although that's much later. I mean, we talk about 1979 through to 1988 there. So it's a long time for it to have had some effect, but it's possible in the sense that you're getting that kind of same kind of feeling that perfection is not possible. And so therefore, you know, maybe, I mean, what's it saying? Tolerance. The practicable and possible thing is used a lot nowadays. a lot more than I remember back in the 80s and 90s even. She used a lot, people really focus on that. And she used to say, well, in that case, I can do this and I can do that. And so, yeah, there you go. So by the time we get to the 1930s and then into the very early years of the 1940s, all the arguments that set the vegan movement on the road, the foundation of it, were in place, and they were being rehearsed over and over. And as you can see, they've been reversed, for a long time, quite a few decades, in fact. But we are getting closer and closer. This is 1943, so the year before the foundation of the vegan social movement. Leslie Cross declared that milk and its derivatives are products of pain, suffering, and abominable interference with the law of love. Leslie Cross talked about love quite a lot in his essay, which is quite interesting. So it's a little bit hippie-trippy for a lot of people, if you like, but he did talk about it. And then in 1944 itself, but still before the advent of the movement, Semple said that if cruelty is the criteria, then dairy products are likely to cause more of it than flesh products. Now, again, this is a very kind of modern sounding thing. And again, it's something that the vegetarians have difficulty with. I've known a lot of people be quite shocked when this kind of argument, as it were, is appreciated and then sinks in a sense. Because if you were to imagine, for example, a dairy-heavy vegetarian, they're probably causing more animal suffering, and again, if cruelty is a criteria, than a dairy-light flesh consumer. So, ironically, somebody on a carnivore diet in this modern age could be causing less animal suffering than a vegetarian right now. The only caveat I would say to that is that I know for a fact now that a lot of vegetarians, they still adhere to the label vegetarian, and that's how they self-describe, but they will use, the plant milks and, the vegan cheeses quite often. So there's usually only a couple of items that would mark them as a vegetarian rather than a dietary vegan. We're talking about diet here, obviously. So that's a kind of, an interesting kind of part of it. I mean, it's like with the modern vegetarian societies, we were talking about this. Most vegetarian societies nowadays seem to be run by vegans, but they seem to have like an identity problem in the sense that, what is our role now, now that veganism is the moral baseline type issue. And so I think it's a real kind of identity crisis for them, really. Okay, so we're moving right now to the actual birth of our movement. Watson, this is just before the beginning of the movement. He said again in this argument within the vegetarian literature, the cow feels the loss of her calf in much the same way as a human mother would feel the loss of her child. Sometimes she will cry for days. And I told this story before, that I was at an Earthlings experience event in Dublin, and there was 3 dairy farmers who trotted up to the event, 3 female dairy farmers, and one of them was saying that the thing that really upsets her was the crying of the mother and the calf. Because I did say, well, you could do something about that, as it were, close down. She called it lowing. She said, I hate to see the cows lowing for their calves, as it were. And I asked her a subsequent question, which I was quite surprised about the answer. I thought it would be the other way around. I said, do you think it's worse to separate the calf straight away? Or in some cases, like certain uses of other animals, for example, so-called beef, they might be kept with their mothers for 3 to 5 months, for example. Is it worse for them to be separated then or straight away? And she said, oh, definitely later on than very early, because they're really, really bonded by then, and it's really distressing for them. I was expecting, for some reason, for the answer to be the other way around, but it wasn't to be. Okay, so August 1944 now. Elsie Shrigley and Donald Watson. So that's Elsie Shrigley is somebody there will be a time tunnel about, and Donald Watson certainly as well. Elsie was sometimes called Sally Shrigley in the literature. They then go to the Vegetarian Society and they propose this non-dairy section. Watson kind of reports on it. The thing you can see to the left there, the Vegan News, that's the document that was the first document that the Vegan Society produced, and it was written by Donald Watson. He says that there were sympathizers within the vegetarian movement to the idea of a non-dairy section within that movement. But ultimately, it was rejected. The Vegetarian Society said, look, we actually want to concentrate on opposing flesh consumption. And also another strand as well, which was the fact that a lot of vegetarians thought that if you avoided animal products completely, you would die. They actually believed that. And a lot of doctors would say that. And so the early vegans had to contend with the fact that a lot of their vegetarian friends, a lot of the doctors that they knew and the general public, obviously, all said that they were going to perish because, it wasn't possible for human beings to live this way. Which is why, incidentally, in the very early years of the vegan social movement, there was a big focus on health because they had to kind of prove that it was a feasible thing to do. So that was the big thing. And it wasn't until to the end of the 1940s when suddenly, people like Leslie Cross in particular said, okay, we've sorted that out. We now need to focus on vegan philosophy and, sort that bit out, which took place in the early years of the 1950s. So the Vegetarian Committee said to Shrigley and Watson that they would be freer if they worked on their own and separate. So they suggested that they worked independently of the Vegetarian Society. I always claim that this was a huge favor for our movement. I'm not convinced that the philosophy that eventually blossomed by the time we get to something like 1955, I'm not convinced that it would have arose if the vegans, as it were, would have been subsumed within the vegetarian movement. So I think it did us a great deal. In fact, they said that we would be freer to do our own thing. And one of the things that they did do was evolve what we now regard as vegan philosophy. So I think that is true. Shrigley declared that the new vegans were idealistic. Other movement historians like Samantha Calvert of the Vegan Society point out that there was a bit of an anti-establishment thrust within the vegan movement founders. Cross declared that he thought of vegans as pioneers, and Watson said that they have a spirit of pioneers amongst them in that first document. And veganism didn't have a name at this stage. In fact, in this first document, Watson is actually asking, what do you think? There's a bit of a vote. I don't think there were many members at the time, but there was a bit of a vote. I mean, there was interesting that people put forward ideas like dairy ban and stuff. And so luckily we ended up with vegan, I think, which was good. We're up to the actual birth of the actual vegan movement. And so this is where we end our time for today. But it is an interesting kind of gestation period in the sense that it was obvious that there was a lot of vegetarians, although classified as a minority, who started to kind of become a bit wary of any animal products whatsoever. And the people who eventually become the founders of the vegan movement were prime movers in all of that, which kind of makes sense. Yes, indeed. So the women pioneers of our movement, in fact, when I've done this before, I've called it the founding mothers because we get a lot of rhetoric in the movement about the founding fathers of the movement, but these, if you like, are the founding mothers of the vegan social movement. And again, I want to stress that when I talk about the vegan social movement, I'm talking not about the people who went plant-based for the first time or were concerned about other animals or anything like that. These are the people who came together and put together a social movement, which they called a cause. So that's what marks them out for me. These are the people who formed the vegan social movement and also gave it its name, of course. So this is part 1 of 3 of this kind of mini series within the time tunnels. It won't be week on week, but it'll be 3 in the end, if you like. And the first 2 people are those you can see on your screen: Elsie Shrigley and Dot Watson, or Dorothy Morgan, as she was. And Elsie Shrigley was also called Sally Shrigley. So there's a lot of name play going on. Now, a general point that we say at this stage is that the demographics of the animal movement, or the movements, so whether you're talking animal welfare or animal rights or animal liberation, it's the same for all of them. It's been revealed that most people involved are and always have been women. For example, there's an interesting thing that I found in the Washington Post from 2019. And they say, we found that political conservatives and more religious Americans were less likely to support animal rights. Women were much more likely than men to support them, the animal rights movement. Most interestingly, however, we found that attitudes about LGBT rights, universal health care, welfare of the poor, improving conditions of African Americans, and supporting birthright citizenship for US-born children of undocumented immigrants were all strongly associated with views about animal rights. And they conclude, in other words, people who supported an expansive concept of human rights and welfare were also most likely to support animal rights. So that part of the survey that we're focused on, of course, today is the fact that most people in the movement are women, and kind of always have been. But then there is a movement issue that feminists have pointed out, like this one: in the patriarchal space of non-human animal rights activism, the voices and contributions of many women who helped build the movement are generally silenced or forgotten. That's a bait from the Vegan Feminist Network. It's claimed that even in a movement then, with a membership historically and currently dominated by women, women's voices are often the least heard. Now, the very first version of this Time Tunnel talk that I ever did was for VegFest. And so I remembered when I came into the movement, and we talk about the late 1970s, early 1980s, it coincided with the time when women were very, very prominent in the movement, or at least in the movement that I knew, i.e. the British movement, spreading over to the North American one. For example, in Britain, people like Paddy Broughton and Margaret Manzoni were the management, really, of the BYV, the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. Angela Walder was their scientific advisor at the time. Jean Pink, she founded Animal Aid in 1977. Juliet Gellatley was and still is the prime mover of Viva. Jan Creamer founded ADI, which stands for Animal Defenders International, and she worked for the NAVS, which is the National Anti-Vivisection Society. Louise Wallis was the NAVS Regional Campaigns Officer in the 1980s, and then she moved to the Vegan Society, and she is the person who initiated the annual World Vegan Day events. Mimi and Jenny Spence, I remember from my time sabbing, ran the Essex Hunt Saboteurs Association. Muriel the Lady Dowding was co-founder of Beauty Without Cruelty, and also active in the Lord Dowding Fund for Humane Research. And then when it comes to authors, we have people like Rebecca Hall, who published Voiceless Victims. Brigid Brophy wrote a very influential article in 1965 about animal rights. Then we got books by Ruth Harrison and Rachel Carsons. We got Ingrid Newkirk in the States, founding PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And in Ireland, we have people like Bernie Wright and Nuala Donlon, who were amongst the co-founders of a group called AFAR, which stands for Alliance for Animal Rights. So when I came into the movement, women were very prominent. The issue now, I suppose, and there's times when this is worse and sometimes better, as it were, is the general invisibility of women, you know, and that applies to the start of the vegan social movement. So much so that Samantha Calvert, this is Dr. Calvert, of the Vegan Society, and she wrote in Veggie Vision TV, which is still going and run by Karen Ridgers, another strong woman of the movement. She described Elsie Shrigley as a shadowy figure in the movement, despite her vast importance in its earliest years. You know, so one of the pioneers of the movement is seen as a shadowy figure, and you'll see that being repeated really with what's to come. So in August 1944, Elsie Beatrice Shrigley, often known as Sally for some reason, don't ask me why, I don't know that bit, joined with Donald Watson in pushing for a non-dairy section of the Vegetarian Society. So we've covered this already in a previous time tunnel. And so we saw then that the Vegetarian Society, in a friendly kind of way, said no to this idea of a non-dairy section. And they basically said, no, just strike out on your own. And so that's what they did. And then hence the vegan social movement was born in 1944. However, Shrigley herself was involved in the internal affairs and issues of the Vegetarian Society for many years after 1944. And also that's the case with many of the other vegan pioneers. They talked at the International Vegetarian Union Congresses in the late 1940s, throughout the 1950s, into the 1960s, and sometimes as late as 1980. So this goes back to something really that Donald Watson developed, which is the kind of veganism is critical of vegetarianism, but shouldn't be a question of attacking vegetarians. So that was a distinction that they made then. Now, going back again to the formation of the movement, this is what Shrigley herself said. I'm not going to read this all this out, just some of it. She's talking about 1944 to 1965. What memories I have of those years. The first meeting on Sunday, November the 5th, 1944, bracket a sunny day, which is always interesting, the fact that a British person would have to mark the fact that it was sunny in November at the Attic Club near Holborn Station. So this is in London, where the name vegan was decided and future plans discussed. The meetings, social and annual general meetings, were very enthusiastic. And then we have some of the early issues. In the 1950s, some vegans were ill, and I remember with gratitude the help given to us by many vegetarian doctors and Dr. F. Wokes. Not woke, Wokes. And it's interesting that because, you know, we tend to think of vegetarian doctors and certainly vegan doctors as something that is rather new, but they existed even back then. And then she said towards the bottom, I am more thrilled than most that the Society is celebrating its 21st birthday. So this is her recollection of the founding of the movement, this little kind of band of people who got together and just did what the vegetarians said, strike out on your own. They didn't expect that they would have to do it. So suddenly these people who were pushing for a section of the Vegetarian Society found themselves starting an entirely new social movement, which is not what they expected. In the third edition of the Vegan News, and that was published in May 1945, Donald Watson reports on the formation of a temporary committee of the Vegan Society. The committee held meetings every month, and they'd held one earlier in April. And they began the process of expanding the concerns of the so-called non-dairy vegetarians far beyond what was called in those days the milk issue. And Watson writes this about the new movement's aims. It was unanimously decided that the society, which had developed from a small group of non-dairy vegetarians, should work for the abolition not only of all food of animal origin, but also of commodities made from animal products, in particular those from the slaughterhouse. So this essentially is the start of the evolution of what we now regard as vegan philosophy, which was finished, if you like, by about 1955. So it took quite a long time. Going back to what Shrigley said about the health problems, they really had to prove in the very early years that it was feasible to live on a plant diet. And so that's what they set out to do. And again, I mentioned this in another time tunnel, because they were told by a lot of doctors, I don't know whether the vegetarians were included on this, but they were told by their friends as well that they were going to die. They were literally going to die. And so they had to prove in the early years of the society that it was actually feasible to live on a plant diet. So Shrigley becomes elected as a committee member and also a committee member of the London Vegan Group. The London Vegan Group was formed in July 1945, and it was initially separated from the National Vegan Society. And Watson reports that she gave a talk at their first meeting, arguing that the vegans' diet was clean, humane, and logical. By the time of the publication of the spring 1946 edition of The Vegan, so it changed from the Vegan News to The Vegan. So this was the first properly printed version of the Vegan Social Movement magazine. So even there is interesting, because it took almost kind of 2 years for this, or at least 18 months for this to happen. It's interesting from our point of view now in the internet age, how kind of slow things were. And so they were founded November 44, but they didn't even get a proper magazine together until 1946, you know, that kind of thing. Shrigley was announced as the Society's Press and Minutes Secretary. Again, you could probably make some feminist-related points about that, I imagine. In 1947, Shrigley had begun a series in the magazine entitled Report of Food Investigations. Now, this is interesting. 1947, she concentrated on chocolates, sweets, and biscuits in the autumn edition of the mag. So I suppose a concentration on chocolate, sweets, and biscuits meant that even back then she really knew how vegans ticked, and so she knew what was of concern to them. But more seriously than that is these are the end of the war years. And so that meant that rationing was still continuing. And so there was a lot of hardship after the war. And possibly, especially those early vegan pioneers who would declare themselves as conscientious objectors. So that was quite interesting. So it must have meant that sweetstuffs in those days were a great treat, because we were immediate years after the war, and, you know, things were trying to get back to normal, I suppose. I suppose it's surprising, though, that there seems to be no shortage of chocolate suitable for vegans in 1947, which again is not something you'd expect, is it? You'd expect that there would be no such thing, but that's not the case. Now, Sam Calvert, the historian, said that Shrigley's early work on the products suitable for vegans, and this is one of the things that the Vegan Society really kind of went for, because there was no labeling back in those days. We've got to remember that. Again, things were much different in those days. Everything was slower, but everything was more difficult. There was no labels on the jars and the packets, and so it all had to be done by letter, and then confirmation, keep tracking it, this kind of thing. She said, Calvert says that Shrigley's work laid the groundwork for something called the Animal Free Shopper, which was published every year by the Vegan Society for a long time. It's a very small little booklet which you used to be able to put in your pocket, and all vegans of my generation would have one. And it was kind of a godsend, really, because you'd go into a supermarket and you get your little shopper out, and it would virtually tell you what, you know, was okay and what wasn't really. It was obviously before the age of the internet. Shrigley was to work for the vegan movement in one capacity or another for 33 years until she died in 1978, which is a pretty good track record. She was, as said, a vegan delegate at the Congresses of the International Vegetarian Union, a long-time member of the Vegan Society's committee, and then in the 1960s, she was the organization's deputy president, and then she became the president as well. And so in 1967, in a warm tribute entitled Vegan Since 1944, by someone called SNC. Now, I've never been able to figure out who that was, but I think it's probably Serena Coles, a person called Serena Coles, who was a committee member of the Vegan Society at this time. She wrote an obituary, really, or a tribute, saying, Elsie Shrigley was remembered as a pioneer of the movement who was still playing an active part in the outworking of the idealists who first brought the society into being. Now, this little statement is really interesting. This happened a great deal. A lot of the early pioneers, and then the ones who came like 10 years later, they were urging the people in the movement to stay kind of faithful to the developing philosophy and the radical view of the founders of the movement. And that went right through to about the 1980s. You can find little statements where, and people like Watson looking back, 50 years and all that kind of stuff, they would say, don't forget the values of the pioneers. They're very important. We want them to be upheld. We don't want any kind of slippage. Sadly, slippage is exactly what's happened, but that's what they wanted. They wanted consistency of radical values, which has sadly not really occurred. Now, emphasizing once again the fact that the Second World War was an important factor in the lives of many of the movement's co-founders, it was noted that Shrigley acted as a leader of the street, it was called, in what was called the Fire Guard Service. So again, some of the people who wouldn't fight in the war ended up fighting fires in terms of being, the bombed cities, etc. Thanking Shrigley for her service to the vegan cause, SNC finished with, she had reminded us that the Vegan Society was formed because of correspondence in the Vegetarian Messenger of Leslie Cross, who inspired her to become a non-dairy vegetarian. Now, Leslie Cross, who is a man, even though it can be confusing in that sense, Leslie Cross becomes a central player in the evolution of vegan philosophy. And so he will be a subject of a time tunnel to come. Okay, so now we move to our second person, Dorothy Morgan. Now, in the acknowledgements of a book called Ecofeminism, Feminist Intersections with Other Animals and the Earth, which is edited by Carol J. Adams and Laurie Gruen, this is 2014. Dorothy Morgan is credited with coining the word vegan. She's also credited, I'm not quite sure if this is the right word, with marrying Donald Watson. She helped to found the Vegan Society, and she promoted veganism as both a worldview, this emerging philosophy that I was talking about, and a word. The word didn't exist. It was a brand new word that we were dealing with for a brand new cause, a brand new social movement. Now, many of you will probably know that a number of other names were under active consideration throughout this kind of very early period. These are some of them. So All Vega was suggested. So basically this little group of people, they were, doing a bit of a focus group and saying, okay, we've got to come up with a name. We're not non-dairy vegetarians anymore. So what are we? So All Vega was one. Dairy Bans, the Total Vegetarian Group, Neo-Vegetarian, Vitan was one, and Benivore. So I always say at this point, I'm rather glad that they picked on the word vegan, because none of those other ones sound very good to me. Now, this is interesting. this is the Donald Watson archive. So we've got some sociologists working on the Donald Watson archive, and their names are there: Kate Stewart, Iris Craane, and Mathew Cole. I think they kind of pointed out, or at least it is true, that as another shadowy figure, really, there's not a lot out there about Dot Watson. It is claimed that that Dot Watson and not Shrigley co-coined the word vegan along with her. I don't think he was her husband at the time, but could have been at the time. So there's not a lot out there about Dot or Dorothy Morgan, who became Dorothy Watson, often usually called Dot Watson. There is a story, though, that really seems to suggest a heck of a lot about her character, I think. And this is this. And this takes place in 1951. A neighbor of Donald and Dorothy had a glass conservatory. Now, these were new at the time. Birds were not used to a building made almost of glass, even though I suppose greenhouses must have existed in those days. But as it were, a big structure at the side of a building was kind of new to them. So not long after the construction of this conservatory, birds began to crash into the glass because they couldn't see it. On one occasion, a barely alive female blackbird was found. She had collided with a pane of glass and was lying with one eye hanging out of its socket. So even though this is Dorothy and Donald now, even though they thought the best thing to do might be to put the bird out of her misery, they just couldn't bring themselves to do it. So they left her with some water and tried to keep her comfy, as it were, for overnight, both expecting that she would be dead in the morning. However, the next day, she was alive and her eye seemed to have popped back into place. So everything seemed to be grand with this little bird. So they happily released her. And 2 days later, Dorothy Watson was in their yard. I think she was actually putting the washing out, another stereotype. And she claims that a blackbird flew by her, dipping in flight. And she was convinced that this was the same bird saying thank you to her. So whether that's true, I don't know, but it's a nice thing to believe to be true, isn't it? A nice little story. Now, this is interesting. These are scenes from, we're getting to the end now, these scenes from a Patreon post by an author called Lee Hall. This essentially is Dorothy and Donald's grave. So she visited this church, which is called Crosswaith Church, and it's near Keswick, which is a place called Cumbria. You probably can't see it very well, but the kind of bottom left there's a picture of Britain with Keswick kind of pointed out. If people know the Lake District in the northwest of England, just below Scotland, that's where we're talking about. Yeah, Lee Hall said Donald Watson married Dorothy sometime after the war ended. The pair settled in Keswick, Cumbria. They became active members of the Cumbrian Vegetarian Society. But by then, and together with Elsie Shrigley and about 24 like-minded people, they had already launched the vegan movement. Now, what's interesting here, all right, Veganic Graham, we rescued a blackbird ages ago, got him back to good health. He came back often. All right, yeah, you see, that's great, isn't it? Brilliant little stories, those. I love those. So this is the grave, really, and it's an incredibly picturesque place overlooking the lakes. This is maybe a more clear picture. It was bigger before, but I wanted to include the flowers in the bin because Lee Hall said that she wanted to leave flowers, but she wouldn't buy any, and so she kind of raided the bin for some second-hand ones. She also says that Dorothy and Donald were not among the notable people listed by the church buried there. So they actually had difficulty finding the grave in the end. There was no headstone, for example. And so what you get really is just this little mark in the ground, a little mark in the ground, which is where they were buried. So they didn't make a big deal out of that. You can see all around Lee Hall in that picture. There's, kind of formal headstones. But what she's looking at is the actual grave. Right. So that is your first two of the powerful women of the vegan movement, Elsie Shrigley and Dorothy Morgan, who became Dorothy Watson. Also, in terms of time, we're not going very far today. We're kind of hovering around the early 40s, but really, in terms of the focus of this, it's basically 3 years, 46, 47, and 48, in particular 47. So that's kind of where we're at. So indeed, welcome to another Time Tunnel. So this is Fay Henderson. Oh, I need my eyes for this now. It's Fay Keeling Henderson. That's her full name. So that's where the K comes from. And as I said, 1947 seems to be a big year for her, really. The first thing I'm going to show you, it's not easy to read, actually, but this is Donald Watson's President's Log in the little bit Star Trek. It's the President's Log, star date, The Vegan, Volume 3, Number 1, from spring 1947. And Watson is essentially thanking the Hendersons, so that's Fay and also G. Allen Henderson, for stepping in and taking some of the burden from his shoulders, essentially. Well, it's funny, I've often described the beginning of the vegan social movement as a bit chaotic. I think I might change that now, because when you think about it, they did remarkably well in the sense that they didn't even know that they were going to be running a social movement. And so we've got that story about they applied to be a branch or a section of the vegetarians. So we're going to revisit that a little bit, because Fay Henderson had something to say about that. Now, just as a side note too, you might remember that I've mentioned that when they were searching for the name that eventually became vegan, there were some weird and wonderful names that were suggested, like dairy bans. There's also all vegan and all vega suggested. And it was the Hendersons, apparently, who suggested those two words. And it seems, according to the historians of the movement, that this is the reason why. I'm going to put this on full screen to give you a better chance of seeing it. The picture on the right looks very almost like a modern picture, I think. But this is the Vega Vegetarian Restaurant, and it's off Pall Mall in London. So the left one is an advert for it, and the right one is a bit of an advert, but also a photograph. By all accounts, this was very popular. There's a really interesting story about this restaurant. And again, this is, we think, where they got the name Vega, which ended up being vegan. And so it was started by some Germans, Walter and Jenny Fleisch, their names, and they'd escaped from Germany because Walter found out, apparently, that he was number 17 on the Gestapo hit list. Now, I'm not quite sure why that was, but it seemed to be the case. And so they fled from Germany. I think they were interned for a while, and then they ended up running a vegetarian restaurant, as you do, kind of escape the Nazis, get interned, and then you open a veggie restaurant. It's just a common way of doing it, I know. Fay Henderson was much more visible, really, in the vegan movement than someone like, say, Dorothy Watson. For example, Fay, she wrote a lot of literature for the Vegan Society. She served as their vice president. She toured Britain and Ireland giving lectures and cookery demonstrations. And in fact, Scotland too, as we'll come on to see. So this really is just like an advert, really, for the cookery class that she did. And she did this basically from a home in Cumbria, which is by the English Lake District. So it's above Liverpool. So this is an advert for a special course, and that took place over 2 weeks, and it included things like lectures and demos, practical demonstrations, discussions, and garden advice. That was all included. And so essentially what people would do is they would go and have their holidays with them, and then also do a vegan-related course. So That actually sounds pretty great, you know. The Latsies must not have been happy with with the veggie restaurant. Well, presumably they didn't know much about it, so let's hope not. Anyway, and the least we say about Nazis and vegetarianism, the better, because you know what the anti-vegans say about that. She also wrote a cookery book. In fact, she wrote a couple, I think, but this is vegan recipes. This is from 1946. Now, this is interesting as well because of the war. There was a problem getting it printed, so it had a very short print run because of the lack of paper due to the war. So that's another kind of interesting knock-on. In fact, it's really interesting because some people have kind of said to me on TikTok and places like that, "Oh, well, you know, your movement is going for a long time and it hasn't done much." And I have to point out that, yeah, but it was created during a global conflict. And then there was all rationing. And then there was lots of rationing afterwards. And fully, I don't think in Britain, the rationing really finished until the 1960s. So it's not as though it was easy to do in the first place. So even things like getting literature together and putting a book together in particular was difficult. But this was one that Fay did in 46, as I said. Now, sociologist Mathew Cole, he's part of that Donald Watson archive that I've mentioned. He suggests that Fay Henderson was a prime mover in pioneering what he called a consciousness-raising model for vegan activism. In other words, he puts the emphasis on education, at least that's what she did. And to that end, in 1947, and clearly understanding the idea of the vegan curious, she wrote this, really interesting. "It is our duty to recognize the obligation we owe to these creatures and to understand all that is involved in the consumption and use of their live and dead products. Only thus shall we be properly equipped to decide our own attitude to the question and explain the case to others who may be interested, but who have not given the matter serious thought." So that's an interesting quote, and it actually informs her general view about the relationship between vegans and vegetarians. We'll see that as we go along, but she was in particular very interested in maintaining vegan relations with the vegetarians, and we're going to come back to that story about, you know, the split or the you know, the kind of decision, if you like. So here she is writing in 1947, but she's writing in The Vegetarian. So again, there was this link, you know, she maintained contact with the vegetarian community, and so she ended up in the magazines. And she wrote, "It seems a colossal presumption that mankind," product of their time obviously, "should have interfered so tremendously in the life and liberty of the harmless creatures of the earth. But the result is indeed a sorry one. Directly due to men's exploitation, the animals have become both dependent and disease-ridden, while man himself has drifted far from the happiness of healthy simplicity." So there's echoes there of the kind of thing that Watson would say, the kind of things that Cross would say. And then, speaking of humans, she said, "He has become physically diseased, morally depraved, and spiritually degraded," which is a heck of a list of things to go wrong for humanity. But again, that goes back to the largeness of the vegan pioneers project, in the sense that they saw that happening. They'd seen those world wars, they were shattered by it, and then they thought, okay, we need to get out of this. How do we do that? Veganism. So animal liberation, human liberation, all tied up together. This is going back now to the winter edition of The Vegetarian, still 1947. "Man will not interfere knowingly with the lives of others." This is describing the vegan world, really. "He will not kill or eat or drink, nor for clothing, but will find other more natural ways of feeding and protecting himself." Commentary from Ruger in the background. You'll have to wait, I'm afraid, Ruge. "He will not exploit neither man or beast, but strive to live harmoniously from day to day." So This was an article entitled Vegan Values. And then if you look at the back issues of the vegan booklet or magazine, you'll see that that in itself became a booklet. I think it was expanded to something like 19 pages. It was available through the Vegan Society for the princely sum of 6 old pence, which used to be called a tanner in those days. And I think it's probably worth about half a cent or half a, you know, what you say cent in North America and Canada, don't you, cent in Australia? So a kind of euro cent, half a euro cent perhaps. So the article ends with this: it is hoped that any group of people with vegan sympathies in this or any other country will communicate with the Vegan Society here with a view to cooperating in the widest possible application of vegan principles. The forming of a vegan international movement will operate for peace and prosperity throughout the universe. So very Star Trek, not just restricted to planet Earth, which was quite good. You really don't like this, do you? You don't like this time tunnel at all. Getting a real bad commentary here from Ruja. So as I said before, then Henderson in particular seemed very concerned with keeping the contacts within the vegetarian community. She seemed more upset and disappointed than most that the vegetarians had basically rejected the vegans. In her account of it, she hints that the vegetarians saw veganism as extreme, and that was one of the reasons why they didn't really want this non-dairy section. And so it's interesting how, you know, you get some kind of moderate accounts, if you like, or some accounts which just says, well, they were keen for the vegans to just do their own thing, man, type of thing. Whereas, you know, Henderson is saying that, no, they didn't like where veganism was going, and they didn't really want the vegetarians to be associated with it. Henderson said that the Vegetarian Society decision was appealed, but to no avail. And she also said that individual approaches were also made to the vegetarians, and they also kept saying no. And so that's the story that we've learned already, that the vegan social movement gets up and running, and a bit chaotically, as I've said, but understandably so, in 1944, with Watson's first bulletin published in November of that year. And of course, the interesting thing about that is that November becomes World Vegan Month in the 1990s, and November the 1st being World Vegan Day. Moving on to 1948, this is the edition of The Vegan now. Henderson wrote an ominous piece entitled "You Have Been Warned." I'm going to put it on full screen for you because, again, Mathew Cole, the sociologist, has pointed out, or he made something of the subtitle, Advocating Living Without Exploitation. They had that subtitle for quite a long time. And again, it kind of, if you like, indicates their kind of what you might call controversially a pro-intersectional approach, because it kind of echoed Watson's idea that veganism was about the opposition to the exploitation of sentient life. So Cole mentions that in one of his articles about the Vegan Society. In her article, Fay Henderson was responding to dire warnings emanating from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations on the food problem, which can be summarized with this dramatic line: the whole human race is rumbling to destruction. So again, you can't get more kind of dramatic than that. She talks in the article about food security issues. She talks about the transfer of feed for so-called livestock rather than providing food directly for humans, which again is a very kind of modern sounding kind of thing, that, you know, we take away food from those without food, those humans without food, because, you know, it's the usual thing about there's going to be many thousands of humans without food this evening, but there won't be many farmed animals without food at all. So that's usually the thing. It's not that we don't have the food to feed them, it's just that we prefer to give it to livestock, so-called. Okay, Rouge. Okay, and then she says, the solution to this problem lies in the homes of the people as in the organization of governments. Now, this is really interesting thing when you think about when it was said. I mean, we talk about 1948. This is almost like a commentary on something like Extinction Rebellion, you know, this kind of idea that it's all about this kind of, kind of system change. She's basically saying you really need both to occur. I think a lot of people would agree with that, you know. So the problem lies in our homes in terms of our choices and our consuming and that kind of stuff, as well as in the kind of larger kind of structures of society. A crucial part of the solution to the food problem from a vegan point of view is to eliminate what was then called dairy and stock farming. Henderson declares that as unnecessary, extravagant, and cruel. And here she turns to a concern of many of the vegan movement pioneers, which was the state of the soil, involving the art of cultivating the soil. And she concludes by saying that give and take is a good rule in all phases of life, and it especially applies to our relationship with the soil. So Fay Henderson was an admirer of a botanist called Albert Howard, and he was a pioneer of organic gardening. So this is he. I'll put that again on full screen for you to have a quick look at. She had traveled to meet him actually in his wartime home and paid tribute to him in the pages of the vegan magazine after his death. And she was particularly impressed by the fact that he said that food needs to be grown in healthy, naturally balanced soil. Dr. Samantha Calvert, the head of communications at the Vegan Society, reports that the society had turned its attention to the practicalities of bringing about a vegan world as early as 1947. So we're only 3 years in, and already they're starting to think big, if you like. That would then mean the growth of what we now know as vegan philosophy, but it also meant that they were starting to think in terms of how can we help people who maybe want to join us, but also, and this is a very kind of early version of this, they were interested in farmers who wanted to transition. So this sheet is from an article called Ripened by Human Determination. It's part of the history of the movement section of the Vegan Society website. He says, the War Agricultural Executive Committee, WAEC, seemed to have an iron grip on farming in the post-war years. And in particular, they could take control of any farms that they deemed to be inefficient. So again, this is all part of the kind of post-war kind of situation. The once held passion for gardening of the, yeah, well, interesting. There are still some people with veganic allotments. I know a couple of people. They're not influencers, shall we say that? They're of an older generation. So we've got the case of Mrs. M.W. Austin Goodman, and she is a Welsh farmer and runs her own farm in Wales, and she contacted the Vegan Mag, and Fay was the editor at the time. So Austin Goodman was a vegetarian farmer, and she was running a farm that produced oats, wheat, and dairy. But she wanted to get rid of the dairy because she was thinking strongly about vegan ethics and everything. The problem was, and going back to this government thing that could just close her down at a minute's notice, is that the dairy element of the farm was the most profitable. And so she then had a problem. She'd begun to take veganism seriously, as I said, but she was almost like financially couldn't kind of do it. So how could she keep her farm and eliminate her main source of income on moral grounds? And so Henderson, as far back as 1947, said that the Vegan Society needs to work out something for farmers such as this in order that they can help such people. You know, she talked about bringing about a workable scheme that could help farmers such as this one. Now, sadly, I don't know the end of the story about whether they were able to help her, the farmer, or not. but they were aware that they probably needed to that extent. So that was quite a good thing. I hear people daily tell farmers to stop farming. The 1% of those people who offer solutions or assistance to make any transition is a fraction, and mostly is down to lack of info. Yeah, well, it's the one form really of political campaigning that I think is possibly worthwhile, and even now. I think the first job about helping farmers transition is to understand the subsidy system. And as far as I know, the subsidy system is like economics. It's very difficult to actually understand what it's all about. In Britain, well, obviously, Brexit is going to cause extra difficulties for you. Where I am in Dublin, we're still part of the European community. So that would mean that we would need to understand how the subsidy system works on a European-wide level and see what kind of pressure could be brought in order to help farmers. As we know from our TikTok discussions, the real problem for a lot of farmers is the startup costs, thinking about the startup costs. They're looking at their dairy farm, as it were, and probably thinking, wow, if I was to strip all that away and start again, look how much that would cost. And then they think, okay, well, if I go for vertical farming, well, again, I'd have a whole new startup cost problem. And so that's where the subsidy is going to have to play a role. So Henderson did quite a few talks, as I mentioned. She did cookery demonstrations in Edinburgh, and she did talks in Dublin and Belfast. She did say, actually, that or at least it's reported, that the Dublin one was well attended. The Irish were a little bit behind in terms of their understanding of veganism, but they were attentive and a good audience, as it were. And again, what tended to happen is that when she did these talks, she would do it through the vegetarian societies. She also ran this thing called Po Puree in the vegan, and people basically kind of write in saying, well, I can't get this, so what do you think? And, can I get a vegan version of that and all this kind of stuff? You do see a generational difference here, because in those days, it wasn't the way it is now, where you can virtually replicate anything that you like. And essentially, she kind of says, so it's a little bit like the lyrics of that Rolling Stones song, you can't always get what you want. And she was basically saying, look, we'll never be able to have fluffy cakes like the non-vegans. It's just a fact of life, and so we have to put up with it, kind of thing. So in those days, a lot of people were asking, but the answer to it was, well, at this time, it can't be done. So again, for modern day vegans watching this, things are pretty different now and much better in that sense. That's a kind of good final lesson to take from this, in the sense that it just goes to show how things have moved, if only on the dietary side of things. And we're into the 50s, late 50s, and into the 60s. Now, this is really interesting from the movement's point of view. There is a sense now that we're starting to see the vegan movement starting its process of moderation in terms of a movement away from radicalism. But for now, welcome to the Time Tunnel. Yeah, so I call this little kind of mini series within the Time Tunnel the Founding Mothers, or the strong female members. So Eva Batt was born in 1908 and died in 89, so died at the age of 81. Now, she played quite a significant role in the development of the Vegan Society. Chairperson for 15 years. She was also the Society's vice president for a while. And one of her most significant contributions was editing something called the commodity pages of the vegan. And she did that for over 20 years. The Society were the publishers of her two fairly famous cookbooks. At least for my generation of vegans, everybody had Eva Batt's cookbooks. So you got What's Cooking And then there was, I can't really find the original, it was What Else Is Cooking, but I think those two got subsumed into the things on the screen there. You see Vegan Cookery, and the updated one, which has obviously got a much more modern appearance to the right there. What's Cooking is one of those books where, you know, it was kind of laminated kind of pages, you know, and so it was designed to open up there and then when you're cooking, because you could wipe the pages down. So everybody had What's Cooking. It was very kind of fairly kind of famous. She was also a council member of the American Vegan Society. So that's interesting in the sense that there was a different set of claims makers from the American group. They were more into talking about things like ahimsa, which they defined as dynamic harmlessness. She was also a director of Plamil, and they began selling canned soya milk, the concentrated version, in 1965. She also worked for Beauty Without Cruelty. I can't forget the fact that they used to sell these kind of fake fur coats or faux fur coats, but they used to sell them with a really big badge, absolutely ridiculously sized badge that people used to wear, which said, "Make no mistake, my fur is fake." She also owned a shop that sold vegan-friendly food, clothing, and footwear. So she was very active in her time. The first time she appears in the Vegan Society's committee in the listing is 1958. And here we see that. I'm going to put that on full screen. Now, it's not particularly well reproduced, so you probably won't be able to read much of it. One significant part of this, actually, though, is you'll see that the Vegan on the left, the magazine or the journal, so that's where we first encounter Eva Batt. This is winter 1958. But if you see the one on the right there, we can just see the top part of it. It had that strap line, which the sociologist Mathew Cole pointed out, advocating living without exploitation. So that had kind of gone by the late 1950s. So again, what we might be seeing from a social movement point of view, or from the point of view of the social movement organization known as the Vegan Society, is that this might be part of the process of moderation. Now, one person who's talked about moderation within social movements a lot is sociologist Corey Lee Wrenn. Talked about social movement professionalization, and the idea of becoming professionalized kind of sounds good, but it's got pros and cons. First of all, it becomes much more organized, but then the typical pattern is that these organizations then start to de-radicalize, and that means that they're more moderate in terms of what they say and often what they do. And so Corey explores this idea in a couple of books, but also this Journal of Gender Studies. And she argues that it's rather necessary, a necessary drawback to professionalism is the moderation in goals and in organization. And they must appeal to a larger constituency to support a larger overhead. And so what's that's alluding to is that part of the professionalization process is when you end up getting things like staff, buildings, offices, physical offices, and that kind of thing. And she also says, quickly won victories are essential for the professionalized organization's fundraising obligations. So this is something that is a problem for this movement in particular, in the sense that that tends to mean that there almost like needs to be a whole series of victories announced every now and again to kind of keep people subscribing to your organization, essentially. So that's seen, I mean, this is social movement theory, and it kind of applies to all social movements, but it certainly applies to the animal movement. If you don't kind of announce a victory every now and again, then you could have a kind of problem. This is 1959 at this stage. So Eva Batt was producing news items for the Journal of the Society, and news items from all over the world. And again, you have to say that most of these were welfarist in nature, and it talks about those involved with animal welfare. All this kind of language is kind of replete throughout this period. Just speculating on this, I tend to think that this is possibly because the society now has found its feet as a social movement organization, and it started to become known. It started to make contacts on a global level, and so it starts to feature news from its, as it were, allies and contacts from all over the world, and all of that is kind of welfare based in nature, which they're reproducing in the magazine. A lot of the work that Eva Batt got involved with was about food labeling and about trying to find out which foods were vegan friendly, which then could be reported in the journal. Obviously, this is well before the age of the internet and everything. So if you look at this, for example, now this is interesting. This is the University of Reading in Britain, and it's kind of like a bit of a history of food labeling law. And as you can see there, probably on the left, 1943 is where it starts. It kind of goes in reverse order. So we don't really need to look at the details of this, but virtually every year, sometimes more than once a year, there was something that came through, okay, right up to the 1970s. And that was to do when Britain entered the European, or the common market, as it was called. In those days, there's even issues coming through to the 1990s in this. A lot of these regulations were to do with people being conned. In fact, there's a little summary here. So the very earliest moves towards the regulation of labeling came in 1938. And it says here about made it offence to sell a food or a drug which had a label which falsely describes that food or drug, or is otherwise calculated to mislead as to its nature, substance, or quality, unless the seller was able to demonstrate that he did not know that the label was incorrect. Just says the label incorrect there. I think it's a typo. So this is what we've got going on. And of course, the issue for vegans is the fact that all this legislation doesn't necessarily mean that manufacturers had to specify in very careful terms all the ingredients. And so what the vegans were left doing really was to write to the manufacturers. In fact, those who've seen Ronnie Lee talk about this, even when he went vegan in 1972, he said that the labeling then was still pretty dodgy, to the extent that all the vegans were eating a peanut butter, which ended up having so-called beef fat in it. And so it could really be a kind of problem for vegans. And so in that sense, Eva Batt took on this kind of task, if you like. And she did a lot of writing to manufacturers in order to establish whether their products were vegan friendly. And she became known as the commodities investigator of the Vegan Society. This is the item that was at the top of each of the journal's commodities kind of pages. All the following commodities are free of animal content, and we have the assurance of the manufacturers that they do not come into contact with animal substances during processing. So all the kind of issues and worries that we might have as modern vegans were rehearsed here. This was the time when animal charcoal was being used to process white sugar, which is no longer the case in Britain, and I don't think in much of Europe, probably all of it. If I go back, you can see all the different, I don't know if you can see them, but there's all the different manufacturers there being contacted, including Kellogg's, all these groups. Some of them are saying, well, we've got labels. Others are saying, well, no, we can assure you, even though we don't have labels, and this kind of stuff. So it was a kind of big deal for the vegans at the time to find out what the vegan-friendly items were for kind of obvious reasons. This is winter 1959. And so Eva Batt, the commodities investigator, is still busy. And she produces an 8-page Christmas special. What they're suggesting is that each time the journal came out, which was 4 times a year, that these sections were pulled out and put into a separate file, and therefore would end up being the kind of database for each and every member. And so they actually put the commodities pages in the middle of the journal so they could be removed without doing any, you didn't have to rip them out. You could actually just unstaple it and then staple it again. So the idea was for people to make up their own kind of database. And of course, later that developed into things like the animal free shopper and this kind of thing. So these are some of the concerns of the movement in its kind of early years, in a sense, is the fact that they needed to be able to alert members to what was vegan friendly and what was not. This is the Christmas dinner part of this commodities thing. And you'll see there that it's got julienne soup, wholemeal rolls, stuffed Brazil nut roast, gravy, chestnut balls, apple sauce, Brussels sprouts, braised carrots, roast potatoes, Christmas pudding, nut cream, mince pies, coffee, and homemade sweets. And then you've got the recipe for all of that laid out in the magazine. And so this is quite interesting. I mean, we're talking about the end of the 50s here. Britain is still subject to some forms of rationing due to the war years. And yet, you know, often vegans of a certain age will get that question, oh, it must have been so difficult back then. And as you can see, there are some things that were available. And we've, somebody said that they're hungry. Thanks, Roger. Yeah. Well, go make yourself a Christmas dinner, Graham. I'm sure it won't cause any problems. The brown gravy is part of the recipe, which I thought was quite good. For those people who know me, you know that I'm a big Goons fan. And Eccles from the Goons always maintained that he likes chips with brown gravy. So the vegans had everything in a sense. Now, just before we get the impression that all the early vegans did was stuff their faces, there is a lot more going on in terms of their correspondence, if you like, with the powers that be at the time. So if we move into the 1960s, for example, Eva Batt wrote to the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, which was based in London at the time, probably still is, which was considering yet more recommendations and regulations for food labelling. She sent a letter, which was effectively a list of the demands from the vegan world. And if it came to pass, it would have radically shaken up the entire food industries. Batt argued that the word milk should be used in its technical sense, i.e. as a term for the emulsified liquid, as in vegetable milk, coconut milk, latex milk, etc., etc., and therefore not used necessarily to denote cow's milk only. Now, this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because there's still these big debates and fights going on between industry and the kind of plant-based industry, if you like, with relation to, you know, who can use words like milk and that. And so that's still going on throughout the world, really. She goes on, butter likewise should be referred to as either nut butter or cow butter. Now, I love the idea of them having to label it cow butter, which would be quite an interesting kind of development. I always tell people that cow milk is calf food, but it would be good to reference cow butter, I suppose. Another fairly brilliant labeling demand was that all food containing animal milk or cream, cow butter or cheese made from animal milk should clearly state that on the label. And she said all foods containing eggs, whether or not intensively produced, which is good, should also be clearly marked. And so this was the vegans trying to make an impact on the ongoing labeling regulations that were going on in Britain. So that was the demands. And of course, none of you watching or listening to this will be surprised that none of these vegan demands were ever met. And so it was the vegans were blanked on it, essentially. More generally, she asked about releasing humanity from animal husbandry, which would result in a country such as Britain becoming a next exporter of foodstuff, which is a very kind of early vegan society argument that in a vegan world, virtually every country would probably become a food exporter rather than an importer. And so not only was she wanting the government to really crack down on the labeling of foods with animal-derived ingredients, as it were, she actually wanted them to close down the animal agriculture industry in the name of food security for the country. And she also wrote, again, 64, sorry, Why Vegan? She was, again, arguing that just think what a vegan world would mean for what she described as undeveloped. And then she also put in brackets another term for starving peoples in the world, and what a contribution it would make towards world peace. It is an interesting document, this one. There is quite a lot of cruelty language in it, but you've also got some of the, what I would argue, are elements of the scope of vegan philosophy coming into it, this one being one. And as we see when we get to the next female pioneer, Kathleen Jannaway, they took seriously the idea that a vegan world would mean the end of war and would mean the end of poverty. Here you can see Eva Batt articulating a similar kind of idea. She also said, aside from immediate effects, vegans consider this way of life to be no less a duty to future generations. It will take many ages at the present rate of progress to undo all the results of past wrongs, if indeed this is ever possible. And whatever our actions, it is our heirs even more than we who will reap the results, good or bad, of what we do today, tomorrow, and the next day, until we leave them what? A desert, a conflagration, or a garden of plenty. Okay, also in Why Veganism, the pamphlet from 1964, Eva Batt wrote in it what remains as one of the most powerful assertions of vegan values. And this, for those who've seen my presentations before, will know this particularly well. Veganism is one thing and one thing only, a way of living which avoids exploitation, whether it be of our fellow men, the animal population, or the soil upon which we rely for our very existence. I said that there seems to be some movements towards moderation, and yet here in the 1960s, Eva Batt is remaining kind of faithful to the language of the earliest pioneers when they talk about exploitation, which they meant use. And then you've got, again, the scope of veganism being articulated, whether it be of our fellow men, the animal population, or the soil upon which we rely. And so, again, there's this kind of intertwining of issues, which was part of the vegan scope. This last bit always creates some concern or comment. Like the other movement pioneers, Eva Batt would often talk a good deal about the soil. She talked about it in terms of the correct balance, in terms of its conservation, and as part of the correct long-term use of the land. So that was a particular interest to vegans, and you'll see next time that Kathleen Jannaway was in particular very concerned about these issues. I always say that this issue came back into the movement in the 1980s with the publication of a very influential book by John Robbins, which is called Diet for a New America, where he talked about topsoil and topsoil erosion, these kind of issues, and about how there is just this thin layer of soil separating rock from sky, essentially. And without it, we can't survive. And yet we do incredible amounts of damage to it. And they were concerned about that way back into the 50s and the 1960s. Batt was concerned that her generation of vegans needed to ensure that they protect the soil to, as it were, hand it over to the next generation. And they wanted to hand it over as a valuable heritage. they wanted it to be not eroded or scorched or leached of its essential minerals, which are so necessary for a full and healthy life, she wrote. I suppose that she didn't know that future generations and our generation would be much more ignorant of these issues than their generation was. I mean, now we kind of act as though we don't care much about anything but consuming things, whereas they were really concerned with issues of conservation over generations they were thinking of. And you don't tend to get that, that kind of sense of things nowadays. The role and hard work of the women pioneers was clearly as important as the men in the movement. And again, this is bittersweet, perhaps in practical terms, perhaps more so. The women did end up doing cookery demonstrations and doing the writing, as it were, to the ministries, etc., to find out the vegan friendly stuff. And so there is again that kind of gender divide, which is very kind of stereotypical, I suppose. The women were invariably given the job of researching the food suitable for vegans, as I've said, and managing and running of cookery demonstrations up and down the country, which they did to great effect in actual fact. So they did that job well, but it's quite interesting from a feminist point of view that it was primarily the women who did that. Although on retirement, Leslie Cross did go around the country, but that was on a kind of lecture tour rather than a cookery demonstration tour. So again, I suppose that's just a reproduction of that gender issue. Right, I'm going to finish off with about 3 minutes of film from the recently enhanced version of Open Door. Now, Open Door is a really interesting historical document. It looks incredibly dated when you see it. It was produced in 1976. As Ronnie Lee said in a recent program, he watched this when it went out. But he said in terms of the language, which we're going to find a bit amusing, this was just the language of the BBC in those days. So what had happened essentially was the BBC had said to social organizations, well, look, if you want to promote yourself, we'll come along with all our equipment. You can say what you want and we'll just film it and help you with the editing and all the rest of it. And so that's what the Open Door thing, as it were, is all about. There was a previous one for the Hunt Saboteurs in this series, which ended up being a big recruitment tool. Ronnie says that many vegans joined the movement, or many people kind of, as it were, went vegan on the basis of this. So I've got a 3-minute clip which features Eva Batt to end with. So here we go.
The Vegan Society was formed in 1944.
Let's face it, Erica, cow's milk is for calves, not for humans.
Yes, and we have other athletes in our society too, like Jack McClelland, a wrestler, footballer and cross-channel swimmer. And they all agree that milk is a baby food, not fit for strong men. Eva Batt. Eva is chairman of our vegan council. Tell us, Eva, how you became a vegan.
I remember very clearly, Erica, although it was nearly 20 years ago. There was this railway station platform and there were some cows herded at one end and they were making a very pathetic noise, and at the other end were baby calves, very young, and they too were crying for the mother cows. And of course I asked an official why couldn't they be put together, and he explained that the cows were going to market and the calves were going to the butcher. To the butcher, I said. Why? Well, he said, you can't have milk unless cows keep having calves, and you can only rear a few of those calves as cows. Most of those other poor little things will be in veal and ham pies before long. This shook me. I hadn't realised that milk production was responsible for all the suffering and slaughter. I I had pictured placid, gentle cows happily grazing in green pastures, and I thought how kind the farmers were to relieve them of their milk. I turned again to the cows, because one was nudging my shoulder, trying to attract my attention. And as I turned, she gazed straight into my eyes, and there was a real message. That's the time it came through to me. I knew then I could never drink milk again. And I hadn't. But believe me, I had a terrible time over that weekend, just wondering how I was going to manage. I knew people could live well without meat, but without milk, I really thought I was going to die. So you can imagine how delighted I was when I discovered that there were other people who were living happy, healthy lives as vegans, thinking the way I did. And today, on my 68th birthday, I am feeling, I should say, I'm feeling happier, healthier, and altogether better than ever before.
So, how many times are we going to see those scenes? I mean, those scenes there were filmed in the 1970s, and we've seen it over and over generations later. Separation of mother and child, with the mother following, presumably not knowing what to do. I don't know whether you actually picked up on this, but the young guy of the two kept glancing back at the mother. And that's possibly because he probably knew that sometimes the mothers get a little bit defensive and, you know, might actually attack them, which we've again seen in subsequent films, because they're having their babies taken away from them, you know, and that happens over and over. And then farmers have the gall to say, oh, well, you know, some mothers are not very good mothers. How many babies would a human mother need to have taken away from them? And there's an Irish film where the farmer used the phrase snatched, that the newborn calf was snatched from the mother. How many before you stop being a good mother? So that is a very kind of modern part of the film. I know it's got that kind of very, very dated look about it. At the same time, that scene, you could go and film that tomorrow at a dairy farm, because it's always the same, and it's always, you know, completely pitiful. The separation of a mother from a child, probably one of the most horrible things that anybody could do, and to do it repeatedly and for profit is just pretty disgusting.
Without hesitation, that I think accelerating a trend to veganism is the most important thing we can do today to save all highly developed forms of life on this planet. We live at momentous times, at what could be a terrific turning point in evolution. Nothing, to my mind, can exaggerate the importance of veganism.
So that film clip there, and there will be a later one, it comes from 1992, and it was the 6th International Vegan Festival. And it's recently been enhanced by Andy Atkinson, our new famous filmmaker on the block. And so you need to go to his YouTube channel if you want to see all of it. Oh, hi, Corey. Hello there. I'm glad you could make it. All right, let's see about this. Okay, so that is Not Your Mum, spelled the English way, M-U-M, but then there's a dot. So Not Your Mum dot, not your milk. That's it. And so that's the YouTube channel. So I think there's about 88 enhanced videos now, which have a better video quality, but in particular, there's a better audio quality. So it's well worth having a look, because we do realize in this day and age that if things are not particularly good in terms of production quality, then there can be a problem. Now, in the talk that I referenced there, Kathleen Jannaway does talk about the importance of trees, which became, in the end, her main campaigning focus. And so this is when she switched from the Vegan Society to something called Movement for Compassionate Living, which is still online. You can still find their website. Okay, so Kathleen Jannaway was born in 1915 and she died in 2003. She's very fondly remembered by a lot of people, including someone called David Graham, who is the co-founder of this, which is a journal, Growing Green International. It's kind of twice yearly, and it's published by the Vegan Organic Network, which Jannaway seemed to have something to do with the foundation of, or the expansion of. In fact, Movement for Compassionate Living once got a legacy of £80,000. And the first thing they did was give £70,000 of it away to the Vegan Organic Network. They were trying to create a centre. Their aim was to promote veganism, non-violence in farming, and a cooperative model for working. So David Graham writes this in an article called The Legacy of Kathleen Jannaway. About 20 years ago, Jane and I, that's the co-founders of Vegan Organic Network, went to a meeting in an obscure hall in a back street in Glossop, Derbyshire. I can't remember the title of the talk, but I remember the speaker, Kathleen Jannaway. There was nothing grey about her. He talks about Glossop being rather grey, and I've been through there often enough to know that that's true. Although she was friendly and warm, there was fire and challenge in her manner and her delivery. And as usual with Jannaway, she draws together all the threads that was kind of really part of the pioneers' veganism at the time. So we're talking about themes about war and peace, injustice, social exclusion, cruelty, animal rights, hunger, and consumerism. I would throw in animal exploitation to kind of knock the edge off the cruelty bit, of course. He said her talk was informed, objective, but at the same time passionate and moving. She talked about how food was grown and how the slaughterhouse, a house of slaughter, is a symbol of repression, bringing all these themes together. So in that sense, quite impressively so. When she was the editor of The Vegan, the formal journal of the Vegan Society, she encouraged the development and publication of vegan views. So these pictures are some of the early ones and then some of the later ones. And it really is interesting because there was a lot of argument in the Vegan Society because their first magazines looked very much like these ones on the left. And then they started to use photography, which was controversial at the time. And it seems like the Vegan Views have done that as well. So Vegan Views was kind of more informal than the official vegan journal. And it was designed really as a forum for discussion. It was obviously pre-internet. You know, it was important to be able to produce these kind of newsletters. I remember both the Vegan News and the Vegan Society magazine, of course, in the radical bookshops of the 1980s. So writing in vegan views then, at the time of Kathleen Jannaway's death in 2003, Henry Mather wrote this. She married Jack Jannaway. They shared a radical outlook and seeking a fairer, more caring world, and became conscientious objectors during the war. They were also Quakers. It was a successful partnership with Jack, although never prominent, was constant and reliable support in all of Kathleen's work. During the war, whilst she was preparing a meagre ration of lamb, bunny rabbit ears, Kathleen heard a commotion outside and saw lambs in the field, and in fact, a slaughterhouse truck too. They both made the connection and became vegetarians. In 1964, Kathleen read a review of the book Animal Machines. She then made the connection between milk production and the need to slaughter superfluous male calves. Once she became a vegan, in 1971, having raised 3 children, she took over as secretary of the Vegan Society and dedicated her mind and energy to the vegan cause. Kathleen Jannaway's life and her work was very important in terms of the history of the vegan social movement. So as I said above then, she was born in 1915 and died in 2003 at the age of 87. She had working class origins, and it was these working class values of her parents and grandparents that were to shape her radical vision of the future. So she campaigned first for the Vegan Society as its general secretary and editor of the magazine. That was from the 1970s, and then from 84 onwards was a co-founder of the Movement for Compassionate Living that I mentioned before, and as I said, is still up online. I think the actual base of that is now in Wales, as far as I remember. She left the Vegan Society, and there's some controversy about how and why, but she left really because she wanted to concentrate on ecological veganism, it was called at the time. And if you watch the film I mentioned at the beginning all the way through, you'll see that she's basically saying that's what she wanted to concentrate on. But she didn't want to do it within the Vegan Society. She said that she respected their kind of focus on animal issues as the focus and then other issues as the scope. But she wanted to focus on the scope part of it, if that makes sense. So that's how she kind of went from the one organization to the other. She was born into a very poor family. She remembers, for example, as a child, having to go to bed early on Sundays because the gas would run out. And so she was born into poverty. Her father was a speaker for the Socialist Party of Britain, which later became the British Labour Party. And he would give talks on peace and also the dignity of the working class. Her grandfather sounds like quite a character. He had unorthodox views and was said to be opposed to Kathleen joining the Girl Guides, which he thought were a bit repressive. They represent the status quo, he thought, apparently. So as a bright child, Kathleen Jannaway won an educational scholarship to grammar school, which is the way it worked in those days. And in grammar school, she learned the value of critical thinking and the idea of questioning everything. However, she gave up an opportunity to go to university. It was offered, but she gave that up in order to financially support her family. She worked as a teacher instead. This was a plight of quite a lot of working class people in those days, is the fact that, you know, education and helping their family financially was often something that clashed, and so therefore they would often have to sacrifice their education, particularly for the women, sadly. But that was just kind of fairly standard within the working class. Both Jannaways and Watson had become conscientious objectors. During the war years, they both turned vegetarian when Kathleen saw slaughterhouse trucks arrive to take those lambs away that was mentioned before. But not yet vegan, she helped organize a protest meeting for the organization that was to become, in later years, Oxfam. And the protest was to demand that dried cow's milk was sent to children of allies in mainland Europe during the war. And then we get the move from vegetarianism to veganism. It was her keen ability to see connections between social justice issues that led them really to veganism. She taught children with learning difficulties. She was a peace and freedom from hunger campaigner and served for many years on the executive committee of the Gandhi Foundation. So everything was, as it were, coming together for her in terms of social justice. Then in 1964, the Observer newspaper in London published a 2-page review of this book, Animal Machines by Ruth Harrison. A 2-page review is absolutely extraordinary for those times and for now. And so I think she mentions that in the long version of the video from the beginning. So Harrison's new book at the time was called Animal Machines, the New Factory Farming Industry. This was really kind of new. It deeply shocked the entire nation, this book, the Jannaways included. It revealed, for example, that calves are separated from their mothers to be sent to veal units in which they were tethered and not allowed solid food. And so Kathleen Jannaway said that Animal Machines, the book, had knocked her for 6. It really did kind of surprise her. So I do have it here. And I just want to show you a couple of pictures, nothing too graphic. There is a chapter here called The New Factory Farming, a Pictorial Summary. So this is the first picture, as you can see. Okay, and so this is a depiction of a calf. Now, so there is what was then quite rare, but now is the usual thing. You know, a grain silo stood next to I mean, that looks like a broiler unit. Could be a pig unit, but pig units you usually got brick bases. This one will be so-called poultry. So there is a couple of graphic pictures in this, so I won't show you any more. But the interesting part about it is that for the British audience, that will be the first time they'd ever seen anything like that. And so the shock that Kathleen Jannaway expresses went around the nation in that sense. And that's what would have ended up being the prompt for a 2-page review of the book, which I imagine every author in the world would die for, I suppose. Kathleen says, it was at this point that I realized that these calves were the surplus of the dairy industry, and that milk, which nature intended for them, was being fed to us. Now, of course, that's a kind of fairly modern day thing to say, and we still say it. In fact, we've got a quote coming up from Kim Stallwood talking about how the arguments back then and the arguments now are essentially the same. I think sociologically, it's something to do with the fact that we tend not to identify as animals, and we don't identify as apes, of course, and we don't identify as mammals either. And so, although humans are mammals, and even although we might generally understand what lactation means, it's still surprising for a lot of people to learn that mother cows, also mammals, must be pregnant to give milk. And so you get the arguments about, oh, well, you can create milk without pregnancy, which is true, even in humans, but certainly not the kind of commercially required amount, which is why they go through that cycle of repeated pregnancy, and then they are pregnant and lactating. And so it's a very tough life for a dairy cow, and that's why she becomes so-called spent, as the industry say, in some short years, and then obviously sent to the slaughterhouse. So the Jannaways decided then they would attempt to live without consuming calf food. She said it was the animal issue via her concerns for peace and world hunger that got her into all of this. So let me bring this back in. She said, my involvement in the animal movement developed out of these, in other words, interest in peace and world hunger, particularly when I began to make connections between the different issues. These interconnections were very strong back in those days, and it also wasn't a problem in the movement as it is now. Later in life, she would become involved in something called Plant a Tree for Peace. It was a movement which was started by some of the vegans associated with the movement for compassionate living. But going back to 1964, Kathleen Jannaway, just like most people, they'd not heard of the philosophy of veganism. They knew nothing of the existence of the vegan social movement, which was only 20 years old at the time. And so she was, rather lost and quite isolated, like many of them were. And as an early vegan pioneer, she had the same fears that people like Donald Watson, Eva Batt, and Leslie Cross had held when they first went vegan. And that really was, is it possible or not to survive without any products derived from other animals? And we've got to remember again, when we say this, it seems odd now that it could be a concern, but everybody told them they would die without some products derived from other animals. And that included doctors, as I've said before, on different time tunnels. So there was a kind of lot against them. Now, although her account is rather disjointed, Victoria Moran, who's written a book called Compassion, the Ultimate Ethic, reports on a research trip that she took in 1981 to study vegans both in Ireland and in Britain. And amongst other vegan pioneers that she spoke to, Moran met Kathleen Jannaway, who said that the earliest vegans didn't know if our bones would disintegrate or if we perish in a fortnight. So these are real kind of fears at the time. Eva Batt, as we've seen already, and she also went vegan in the 1950s, she said that she didn't know how she'd manage. She said, I knew people could live without meat, but without milk, no, I really thought I was going to die. And so some of them kind of internalized that message that they got from their vegetarian friends and from their doctors. Animal advocate and author Mark Gold suggested that some of the initial health fears about veganism had been dispelled by the time Jannaway became the Vegan Society's General Secretary in the 1970s. So things moved on and things got better, as it were. The vegan social movement pioneers not only had a revolutionary vision of the future, but they were very brave trailblazers. So we owe them a great debt. I always said that when they got told that they were going to die, they said that we'll risk it for a vegan biscuit, which is what they did. So by the 1970s then, virtually all of the Vegan Society literature was written and typed up and produced by Kathleen and Jack Jannaway. In a leaflet from 1972, it's clear that Kathleen understood the power of culture and of advertising. Writing, the chief, there is a warning really about the language. Obviously, people are a product of their time. I did get a YouTube comment saying that perhaps it needs to be de-chauvinized, the language, but people are a product of their time, and I think people watching this will appreciate that. And so I've left the original language intact. The chief obstacle to man's survival on this overburdened planet lie in the minds of men. Most people find difficulty in adjusting to ideas that do not fit in with the habits and thought patterns of generations. This is very sociological, especially one, as with the feeding habits of the West, both producers and consumers are subject to the high-pressure salesmanship of the meat, dairy, and chemical industries. So there's quite an interesting mix of media sociology and appreciation of the power of socialization in there. Now, the Jannaways were issuing warning about the environmental crisis, which became really key to them. But they started doing that from the early 1970s. Jannaway pointed out, for example, that humanity was engaged in what she called an all-out assault on the living systems of the planet. And showing that she shared a similar radical vision to the pioneers of the movement from the 40s and 50s. This is in terms of their thoughts about the centrality of the moral evolution of humanity. She declared that, quote, the age of the new man is dawning, with the vegan being, quote, the prototype of the new man of the new age. Again, a little bit flowery perhaps, but that was a common idea, that through veganism and through the adoption of the philosophy of veganism, a new type of humanity was possible. And you'll see in the clip that's coming up say something very similar to that. So the Jannaways' house became vegan headquarters in the 1970s. And I always mention this, it is ironically situated in an English town named Leatherhead, which is a great place to have a vegan headquarters. So Movement for Compassionate Living report this. Their house and garden became a venue attended by many over the years for meetings and garden parties to raise funds for the many concerns they were involved in. Now, Ronnie Lee, who became vegan in 1972, as many people will know, went to one of these, I believe, and he said he found it quite an interesting affair. Many will remember Kathleen and Jack's garden as the place where they came together each year with vegans from up and down the country. The meetings provided a opportunity for fellowship and being with kindred spirits, that kind of thing. And it was especially important for the more isolated vegans who could get together and meet people who had the same values as them. And also it was found to be a really good meeting place for vegan children, so they could kind of meet and play together and, you know, as it were, not be weird for a while, I suppose. Mark Gold says that the Jannaways' importance to the development and the evolution of the vegan social movement is absolutely huge. He says that Kathleen was all about linking the compassionate desire to avoid animal products with rational use of world food resources. Gold states that over half-acre of garden was soon turned over to a horticultural experiment where she and Jack successfully developed green manure techniques, i.e. manure from plant sources only, food-bearing trees, vegetables, and fruit beds. Now, many will know that the Vegan Society was featured on a BBC community-based TV program in 1976. It was called Open Door. And reviewing this, Kim Stallwood, who himself went vegan in 1976, says to watch the show today is to be reminded how nearly 40 years on, many of the arguments made for veganism then remain the same today. That more people could be fed directly through plants and than through animal protein, thus alleviating world hunger. That consuming dairy products involved more rights violations against other animals than eating meat. That vegans lower their risk of contracting heart disease and cancers of the colon. That the vegan diet requires vitamin B12 supplementation, although this deficiency also occurs amongst many non-vegans. The latest from the doctors, as I understand it, is that everyone, regardless of their dietary choices, should take a B12 supplement after the age of 50. And that vegans are, according to one of the doctors interviewed, normal, healthy, happy people whom you couldn't distinguish from omnivores, except that they are slimmer and perhaps smile more. So if that's if you recognize yourself in those words, then all the better for it. Kathleen Jannaway is featured at some length in this 76 program, proudly showing off green manure techniques. Now, the show, and Stallwood does comment on this too, the show looks very dated nowadays, although Ronnie often says that when you hear it, it seems so kind of stiff. But it was the way people talked in those days, especially when they were on TV. But it looks so dated that vegan comedian Simon Amstel used sections of the original film in his mockumentary in 2017, which was called Carnage. And a lot of people can't tell the bits that he created from the bits that he just used because they were so kind of close to one another. Not least because in the 1976 film, there is a vegan family featured, and they are Mr. and Mrs. Bland. And so I often think that there goes to show that, you know, people weren't very media savvy in those days, because I'm sure nowadays, if you've got a Mr. and Mrs. Bland in a vegan documentary, you'd say, can we just change your name for the duration? Because it doesn't look good. So I'm going to show you a little clip from it. Now, I did add some subtitles to it because I think it's probably going to be necessary. So let's see if we can get this going.
Kathleen Jannaway, Secretary of the Vegan Society. Kathleen, some say that animal manures are necessary for the health of the soil.
I know people say so, but there's no real reason to back their statement, no research. Hundreds of gardens like my own grow excellent crops with no artificials, no animal manure, nothing except vegetable compost made from vegetable wastes. After all, animal manure is only plants passed through animals. I pass plants through my compost bins instead. All the inedible bits of fruits and vegetables go in layers in these bins. I cover them with layers of weeds, a thin layer of soil, and a sprinkling of herbal activator. And in 6 or 12 weeks, you get marvellous compost. That grows excellent crops. Last year we had 200 weight of tomatoes in this garden, lots of beans, giant cucumbers, and many other crops, all grown from vegetable compost. Why use artificial fertilizers that can do damage to the soil's structure and life and cost irreplaceable fossil fuel to make? Why use animal manure when animals need so much land and work to support them, when you can get good crops with just vegetable waste, earthworms, bacteria that live in small bins? And as for doing it on a wider scale of the farm, why should it be more difficult than cutting grass for hay and silage? Anyway, if England turned vegan, we'd need so much less land to produce food. We'd have wide acres for forests and wildlife and recreation. At the moment, 90% of the agricultural land of England goes to support animals. If we are going to feed people, we have just got to stop breeding these pathetic creatures.
The Sahara Desert.
Yes, and so Jack went on to talk about the Sahara Desert. So they did all that composting and then immediately started talking about deserts, which was quite interesting. As I said, Andy has also enhanced that documentary, so that's also on his YouTube channel, Not Your Mum, Not Your Milk, with a dot after mum, as I said. So Gold claims that some dismiss Kathleen Jannaway as a crank. In fact, he's got a chapter, I think it's called Jannaway Crank or Visionary, I think. And that was due to her utopian vision of the future, which, to be honest, was shared by most of the vegan pioneers. So let's bring the PowerPoint back. She looked forward with optimism towards a tree-based culture in which animal agriculture would be replaced by forests providing food, a mitigating factor against climate change, which is always called global warming in those days, and preventing soil erosion. She wanted to see a global network of tree-based autonomous vegan villages replacing industrialized cities. So Jannaway's tree-based vision of the future is indeed truly revolutionary. It would prevent monocropping, it would end unemployment and refertilize areas of desert. There was even talk about whether money would be abolished as part of Movement for Compassionate Living's vision of the future. She was big on things like bartering and swapping and, community-based kind of cooperation, I suppose. She was also a great supporter of science, but argued that it had to be guided by compassion. The enormous power that humans have needs compassionate direction, she argued. She believed that humanity's moral development had fallen behind, and food is part of the reason. This again is echoing very much people like Leslie Cross and Eva Batt and Donald Watson. She argues that when parents tell their children that they must eat animal products and are punished if they don't, the child must in turn suppress their compassionate side. Interesting social psychology. On the other hand, veganism manifests a properly balanced human being, she believed. In 1986, Jannaway wrote, "Freedom from dependence on the slaughterhouse nurtures faith in the possibility of creating a compassionate age." In terms of active campaigning and advocacy, she said that anger has its place. She also says that in that film that I keep referencing. But it should be an anger that is directed against the act rather than the actor. After all, she argues, you don't change cruel people with more hostility. She said that education is the key to spreading veganism, and this entails us taking the time to educate ourselves. She said that we must be aware that the present materialist, competitive, violent civilization, which has spread rapidly through the world, is not sustainable. We need, above all, a vision and hope of a practically based alternative. She also said, time is not on our side, and certainly the daily slaughter of other animals demands urgency in any rate. Once she had moved then to Movement for Compassionate Living, she developed these ideas of a tree-based culture much more fully. Through growing enough trees, she argued, we can satisfy nearly every human need, including that for food, and at the same time do much to restore and maintain planetary health. Adding, what is needed is a trend towards compassionate living the vegan way. In fact, that's the full title of the group, Movement for Compassionate Living the Vegan Way, with the emphasis on the use of trees and their products. Jannaway warned that humans had created a second population explosion of deliberately bred other animals, competing with humans for diminishing resources, which adds to the creation of deserts, erosion, pollution, global warming, and ozone layer depletion. In terms of her position on interconnections, Jannaway recognized that veganism must be central to our thinking. And again, echoing the views of the pioneers of the 40s and 50s, or the ones a little bit before her, she underscores their point that veganism represents the liberation of humans and other animals. And she also states that with great hope, she thinks that an era of true abundant living will dawn in which humans at peace with themselves, with each other, and with all living creatures will reach heights of creativity as yet unimagined. Okay, so let me drop this out. That's your PowerPoint, and that's your time tunnel. It's my PowerPoint, your time tunnel, but I'm going to show you a last bit of a clip, which really kind of summarizes everything we've said so far. It's really quite impressive stuff. And I hope you enjoyed this one. And I'll see you again next week for another Time Tunnel with a less croaky voice, hopefully.
To doom's watch a little bit, but not for long, because actually I grow more and more optimistic. It seems clear to me that the age of predatory man and woman is coming to an end. He is destroying not only the animals, but the whole planet and himself too. He cannot go on. And the alternative is the vegan way. Compassion to all life, all the animals, and also to the planet, the plants, and the humans. That's the only alternative. And it is our awesome responsibility to bear the task of introducing that alternative to the whole world. I feel that the change will only come when we get the masses of the people changing. It's no good just alone attacking the government. It's no good attacking the industrialists. The politicians will go on until they're frightened of losing the votes. The industrialists will go on until they won't sell their goods. It's the masses of people that we've got to get to, and we've got to raise their awareness. Global warming can be reversed and people better supplied with food and other necessities if we use land for trees and not animal farming. It's not the reform of animal farming we want. It's the end of it. And in a vegan world, as I think you know, there'd be so much less land required to feed people that there could be wide areas for wildlife where animals can live their own natural lives in their own natural ways, free of our interference. Perhaps they would realize that they no longer need to fear us, and we could sometimes have the privilege of making proper relationships with them. But the general picture now, I'm quite sure, is that the age of predatory man is coming to an end. Will a new age, in accordance with the teaching of the great, follow, or will we go right down, right there, and have to climb up the evolutionary tree again? We've all got a part to play in that. But I think generally it's hope. And if we can solve this problem of animal exploitation and spread veganism, we should also solve the problems of war and poverty and all the other things that has caused immense suffering to people and animals through the ages. Veganism is as important as that.